Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay, holding the fort for your regular host, Ladi Akeduale. The headlines. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky admits he does not think Putin is bluffing. United States warns of catastrophic consequences if Russia uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And Russia-Ukraine exchange accusations over shelling around Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. We begin the program this morning with news that Russian President Vladimir Putin has signed several amendments to the country's criminal code, making wartime punishments for various offenses more severe. Under the amendments, crimes such as refusing to follow the orders of a senior officer during wartime, during an armed conflict or combat operations, or the refusal to participate in military or combat operations during such times may result in jail terms for up to 10 years. The Kremlin says in a statement that the punishment for those sentenced to imprisonment for committing especially grave crimes can now be replaced by forced labor or another milder form of punishment only after at least 2/3 of the imprisonment term has been served. The Russian president also signed a law that will punish the violation of the terms of a state contract in the field of state defense, especially if such violations cause damage to the state in the amount of at least 5% of the contract price and at least 5 million rubles, as well as failure to fulfill the contract. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he believes Russian President Vladimir Putin could use nuclear weapons. Putin earlier said that Russia will use all the means available to defend Russian territory. Zelensky says maybe yesterday it was a bluff, but now it could be a reality, in his words. He adds that Putin himself says he was not bluffing when he warned that Russia will consider defending its land with various weapons of destruction. That land could soon include the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, as well as the regions of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, where referendums are currently being held on joining the Russian Federation. Western leaders are taking Putin at his word. When people say it's not a bluff, you have to take them seriously. The EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, said on Saturday. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told news agencies earlier on Sunday that Washington has told Moscow that any use of nuclear weapons will be met with catastrophic consequences for Russia. Speaking of those catastrophic consequences, if Moscow were to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, after Russia's foreign minister said regions holding widely criticized referendums will get full protection if annexed by Moscow. Votes in 4 eastern Ukrainian regions aimed at annexing territory Russia has taken by force, mostly since its invasion in February, were staged for a 3rd day on Sunday. Now, the Russian parliament could move to formalize the annexation within days. By incorporating the 4 areas of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia into Russia, Moscow could portray attempts to retake them as attacks on Russia itself, a warning to Kiev and its Western allies. The Russian annexations raise the risk of a direct military confrontation between Russia and the NATO military alliance as Western arms are being used by Ukrainian troops. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said on Sunday that the U.S. will respond decisively to any Russian use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine, and that it has spelled out to Moscow the catastrophic consequences it will face. Meanwhile, Russians who are in the country's reserves and those who have prior military experience are heading to recruitment centers following a partial military mobilization aimed at protecting Russia's sovereignty and integrity, announced Wednesday by the President Vladimir Putin. Now, the recruitment process is taking place across the country, and videos of shuttles transporting new recruits are already circulating on social media. However, overwhelming amounts of rumors and false information is also spreading on the World Wide Web, forcing the governments to issue statements almost every hour. The government stresses that people will not be forced to enlist, and the military is so far only recruiting those who've been in service and have relevant experience. A hotline was also quickly opened to answer questions from those intending to enlist and their families. According to initial data released to the public of the around 50 people who signed up in Moscow on the first day, about 35 reservists have passed their physicals and were sent to receive training. At a recruitment center in Moscow, many people have showed up asking if they can be recruited. And an independence rights group has said that hundreds of people have been arrested by authorities as protests against Russia's new partial mobilization continue across the country. OVD Info say 724 people were detained across 32 different cities on Saturday. Widespread demonstrations have broken out since President Vladimir Putin announced plans to draft 300,000 men to fight in Ukraine. Unsanctioned rallies are banned under Russian law. But Mr. Putin's move to draft civilians into the military has sparked large-scale protests in urban areas, with more than 1,000 people being detained at demonstrations earlier this week. Some of those arrested on Saturday reported being given their draft papers after being detained. The Kremlin defended the practice earlier this week, saying it isn't against the law. Moscow has also approved harsh new punishments for those accused of dereliction of duty once drafted. Mr. Putin signed fresh decrees on Saturday imposing punishments of up to 10 years in prison for any soldier caught surrendering, attempting to desert the military, or refusing to fight. Russia's top diplomat says the regions of Ukraine where widely derided referendums are being held will be under Russia's full protection if they are annexed by Moscow, and fears Russia could further escalate the conflict and even use nuclear weapons. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, addressing the UN General Assembly and the world's media in New York, attempted to justify Russia's February invasion of its neighbor, repeating Moscow's false claims that the elected government in Kyiv was illegitimately installed, filled with neo-Nazis and oppressed Russian speakers in the country's east. Now, Russia on Friday launched referendums in 4 eastern Ukrainian regions aimed at annexing territory it has taken by force. Kyiv says residents were being coerced into voting and were not allowed to leave the region during the 4-day vote, which Western nationals or nations dismiss as a sham. Asked if Russia would have grounds for using nuclear weapons to defend annexed regions of Ukraine, Lavrov says Russian territory, including territory further enshrined in Russia's constitution in the future, is under the full protection of the state. The comments came after an explicit warning on Thursday by former President Dmitry Medvedev, an ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin, that any weapons in Moscow's arsenal, including strategic nuclear weapons, could be used to defend territories incorporated into Russia.
Референдумы проводятся на основе решений.
The referenda are being conducted on the basis of the decision of the local government authorities. The conditions of those referenda have been published. And following those referendum, as I have already said, Russia, of course, will respect the expression of those people who for many long years have been suffering from the abuses of the neo-Nazi regime. The entire territory of the Russian Federation, which is enshrined and could be further enshrined in the Constitution of the Russian Federation, unquestionably, is under the full protection of the state. This is absolutely natural, and all of the laws, doctrines, concepts, and strategies of the Russian Federation apply to all of its territory.
In the meantime, Russia's defense ministry says Sunday that the Russian forces had struck multiple targets of Ukrainian forces and foreign mercenaries, while Ukraine's military claimed on the same day they had repulsed Russian offensives in several areas of Donetsk. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, the Russian military on Sunday attacked a temporary base of foreign mercenaries in the city of Zaporizhzhia with missiles. In Donetsk, the Russian forces also rocketed an ammunition depot and anti-aircraft radar station of the Ukrainian army. The ministry also says that the Russian air defense forces shot down several Ukrainian drones and intercepted multiple rocket shells fired by the HIMARS multiple rocket launch system. On the other hand, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces said on the same day that the Ukrainian army repulsed the attack from the Russian forces in Soledar and other areas in Donetsk. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian forces used military aircraft and rocket artillery to strike concentrations of the enemy's troops and weapons, as well as the air defense systems. Pro-Kremlin authorities have accused Ukrainian forces of killing 2 people, including a former MP, in a missile strike on a hotel in occupied Kherson. Regional officials said Alexei Zoravko, a pro-Russian former Ukrainian lawmaker, died in the strike. Now, Kirill Stermosov said in a statement that Ukrainian armed forces fired a missile on the Play Hotel by Rebus on Sunday. Kyiv has not responded to the claims. The Russian-installed administration said in a post on Telegram that this was a planned terrorist act, adding that the building of the hotel was not used for military purposes. The statement says that 2 people were killed in the attack, according to the preliminary information. The authorities said journalists from Russian media were in the hotel when the missile struck. However, these claims could not be independently verified. A representative of the law enforcement agencies in the region was quoted by the news agencies as saying the attack was clearly carried out with the help of NATO representatives, according to their intelligence and on their tip. 2 drones launched by Russian forces into the Odessa region in Ukraine hit military objects, causing a fire and the detonation of ammunition, the South Command of Ukrainian forces have indicated today. The command says in a statement on Telegram that as a result of large-scale fire and detonation of ammunition, the evacuation of the civilian population was organized. The statement further adds that preliminarily there have been no casualties. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says heavy fighting is taking place with Russian forces in many places along the front line, some with positive results for Kyiv. Zelensky made this known in his nightly video address. Putin, on Wednesday, ordered Russia's first military mobilization since World War II. The move triggered protests across Russia and sent many men of military age fleeing. Now, more than 2,000 people have been detained across Russia for protesting against the draft, according to independent monitoring group OVD Info in Russia, where criticism of the conflict is banned. The demonstrations are amongst the first signs of discontent since the war began. In the Muslim-majority southern Russian region of Dagestan, police clashed with protesters, with at least 100 people detained. Zelensky acknowledged the protest in his video address.
Жорсткі бойові дії відбуваються на багатьох ділянках фронту.
Heavy fighting is taking place in many frontline areas, stretching a total of more than 2,000 kilometers. This is the next region. This is our Kharkiv region. This is the Kherson region. And also Mykolaiv and Zaporizhzhia region. We have positive results in several directions. And whatever happens this week in Russia, whatever steps the terrorist government is planning, political or military, our state's task, Ukraine's task, cannot be changed. We are fighting for life and freedom of all Ukrainians.
President Volodymyr Zelensky. Meanwhile, Ukrainians in the recently retaken eastern town of Izium say they oppose the widely criticized referendums in Russian-occupied regions in southeast Ukraine, while the humanitarian situation in the town remains dire. A 65-year-old pensioner who was queuing for humanitarian aid from Ukrainian volunteers says she wouldn't take part in such a referendum. Other Izium residents were gathering firewood at abandoned military positions in a forest nearby the mass burial site where hundreds of bodies have been found. Now, Serhiy and Maria, who are a couple, said that they hope after the Zium City Council had resumed its presence, centralized heating will return. Another man gathering wood in the forest, 63-year-old pensioner Serhiy, says he did not have gas nor electricity at home, adding he does not know how to get through the winter. Winters in those parts very harsh. Residents of the Russian-controlled Ukrainian port city of Mariupol cast their votes on the third day of referendums on joining Russia on Sunday. Member of the Electoral Commission, Elena, says that people's activity in referendum was on a very high level, as people are hoping for a peaceful life and restoration of the city. Mariupol was heavily damaged in fierce fighting between Ukrainian and Russian forces several months ago. The referendums have been condemned by Ukraine, Western leaders, and the United Nations as illegitimate. Russia maintains that the referendums offer an opportunity for people in the region to express their view. Ukraine says it will never accept Russian control of its territory and will fight until the last Russian soldier is ejected. Now we have a security analyst, David Otto, speaking to us from Abuja. You're welcome to the Russian invasion.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's begin, if we can, from the aspect of the partial mobilization of Russian citizens into the army, which some people may just term to be conscription in a nicer term. What do you think of the news coming out of Russia that people aren't happy to be involved in this war?
That's very correct. But what you must understand, and you know, we've said this before, that there is a lot of psychological warfare going on. You know, since this conflict, or what Russia calls it, a special military operation, since it began in February. You know, one of the biggest casualties has always been the high levels of disinformation and misinformation. And it's correct that, you know, the Russian government has mobilized about 300,000 troops, you know, and, you know, the aim is to deploy these forces to the areas where it is carrying out the referendum, especially the 4 regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. But again, the Russians, you know, are being faced by a lot of criticism from Ukraine. The Ukrainians are asking citizens to, you know, to avoid joining, you know, the Russian troops. You know, they're calling it conscription. They are saying that most of these, you know, troops that are being mobilized by the Russians are not well trained, and that they will face, you know, their death in the battlefield. They are also calling on them to surrender to the Ukrainian forces, and are saying that this is a method that, you know, they're happy to accept. So it's all about some kind of a moral game here. I mean, again, the battle is not just fought in the field; it is also fought in the information space. So it's a matter of who wins the information space. And so far, both sides are doing their best to either encourage one action or discourage it. But Russia seems very bent on sending more forces, you know, into these areas where it's occupied.
Speaking of information, when you're confronted with state-sponsored media, as one is in Russia, and one has to rely on independent sources such as OVD Info, for which most of the information we have recently concerning the partial mobilization relies, then how does one filter the two? Because on the one hand, we have those who, we've seen some images, we've seen some reports, we've seen some images of people protesting in certain areas, especially in Dagestan, where there's a Muslim majority, and a good number of casualties of people that died of Russian origin in Ukraine are from Dagestan. And then we have the other group of people who say they're happy to go for the recruitment process. And we reported that about 50 people, as at the time of that report, had been called up to be a part of the 300,000 reservists. So how do you filter the information that comes out of a situation such as this?
It is unfortunately very difficult, for any one side, to be seen as the truth teller, because of course, this is the nature of warfare. Every party to a war wants to give out the kind of information that will, boost the morale, not just of the population, but specifically for the frontline troops. The truth is that there will be people within Russia who will oppose, and as you've seen clearly in some of the demonstrations, who will oppose Russia's invasion, but not just that, who will oppose the new declaration that there will be a mass or mobilization of troops, and there will also be people who will be supportive of the Russian move, people that believe in the Russianization of some of the territories that Russia has taken away from Ukraine. So this is very clear, but we will never come to a point where we will have a common ground in terms of how information or the value or the authenticity of information from a battlefield space. So this is the nature of it. They fight the war on the battlefield, they also engage in the information space. And again, as I said earlier on, it's the peak of misinformation and disinformation. And this is part of what we will say continuously as this war rages on.
What are your thoughts on the referendum being conducted by those in Ukraine who purportedly want to be a part of Russia? And secondly, the so-called annexation, if it does happen, of those areas, just as they did to Crimea?
Yes, I mean, there is a critical angle to this referendum. First of all, according to, from a Russian angle, if these people in Luhansk, in Donetsk, in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, if they do vote apparently in favor of, a Russianization or, an annexation of that region, then, effectively, it becomes part of the Russian Federation. And what that means is that any attack by Ukraine, within these areas that Russia has annexed or would annex or perhaps may annex, then it will be a direct confrontation. And I think the strategy that Russia is using here is very critical, because Russia is worried that there is some sort of a comeback, some kind of a counter-offensive, which is being used by Ukraine to regain some of the territories with effective help of the West and the US. So perhaps, for Russia, annexing these territories, getting the people to apparently vote in a referendum, it gives Russia the legitimacy and the sovereignty to protect these areas. And as Vladimir Putin and, the Russian foreign minister made it very clear, that they will protect these areas, even, perhaps considering the use of some level of nuclear warfare, if these areas are continuously attacked by Ukraine. So it's a tactical move, by Russia to annex these territories and to conduct what it calls a referendum. But of course, Ukraine and the rest of the world, well, not the rest of the world, those who are pro-Ukraine and pro-US, they've, condemned this referendum, and they've called it some kind of a fake referendum and an illegitimate process, that Russia is using in these territories. But again, it's one of those complexities that comes with the lack of a way forward, from a peaceful angle to this crisis.
Now, Putin says he's not bluffing as far as the threat to use all the weapons in his arsenal is concerned. And we know some of those weapons include nuclear weapons. After the break, we'll come again with that question with Mr. David Otto, an analyst speaking out of Abuja on the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Please stay with us. welcome back to our continued coverage of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. On hand in Abuja is security expert Mr. David Otto as we continue to look at matters arising. It's good to have you on the show again, and I'd like to continue from where we left off before the break. And I was saying that given the posture of Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, that he will use nuclear weapons, and given that it has been said that he's not bluffing, the United States say he's not bluffing, the Ukrainian president says they don't think he's bluffing. Do you think it's safe to call his bluff?
Well, I don't think it will be safe to call his bluff, because of course the deployment of nuclear warfare or nuclear warheads, has a repercussion that is not measurable by any sense, and one doesn't know for sure what the retaliation is going to look like. Nobody wants a nuclear war, but of course, the question is, as you rightly said, should the world call his bluff? I don't think so. I think what we should be focusing on, in terms of, the global leaders, Ukraine, the US, NATO allies, but also countries like Turkey that have been very much involved in some of the negotiation processes. I think this is a time to accelerate some kind of a negotiation process. But this is going to be very challenging, because, of course, Russia continuously lays claim onto territories beyond Crimea. And perhaps the holding of a 4-day referendum, which is ongoing in the 4 regions, is another nail that will refrain, that will push, Ukraine away from any form of negotiation, because, of course, Ukraine insists that it will want all its territories back. So it's a very challenging situation, that the world is facing. And the more that this war drags on, the more we will have, situations of this nature whereby Russia will continue to dig its heels. But the truth is, none of us, no one, including Russia, wants some kind of a nuclear war. But perhaps this is a call by Russia to the world and say it's time for us to be serious about negotiation. How that pans out is a question that no one really knows.
But what do you really think? If push came to shove, nuclear weapons is not like releasing a Scud missile or shooting an Uzi. And historically, we know what happens when you use a nuclear weapon. We only have to go as far as Japan in World War II to look at the terrible consequences of this. Do you think that Vladimir Putin, at the onset of this military operation, as he calls it, thought he'd have to pull out or play the nuclear card, even if just as a threat?
Yes, I think, I just want to believe that this is more of a threat. As you rightly said, nobody wants to see a repeat of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nobody wants to see that. The impact, both psychologically and, the way that it destroyed the flora and fauna, is not, something that wants to see a repeat of. Perhaps, again, as I mentioned earlier on, the threat of using a nuclear warhead by Vladimir Putin is a clear sign that, the world needs to, readjust. Now, this is, some people may say that, Vladimir Putin needs to readjust himself, but what does he have to lose? After all the heavy sanctions against Russia, most of the Western states, if not all, have, placed themselves against Russia. Russia has been increasingly isolated, although it's finding few friends, in few areas. But we cannot, in any sense of, humility, be able to, take this as some kind of a bluff. I think the world has to, look at the best approach. And I continuously think that the best approach, is to have some kind of a negotiated settlement Now, this is not to say Russia has the right to occupy and own territories in Ukraine. But this is to say that two wrongs do not equally make a right. I mean, the West is also, highly supporting the Ukrainian, offensive. So we need to find a common ground. But, bluff he may not.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on this. Mr. David Otto, security expert.
Thank you.
And now Russia and Ukraine traded fresh accusations over the weekend of shelling around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which has been a focus of concern by international community. In the daily briefing, Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Igor Konashkenov says Ukraine continued provocations in the surrounding areas of the power plant, adding that Ukrainian forces fired 59 shells in the past 24 hours, attacking residential areas in Energobar city and areas adjacent to the nuclear power plant. According to the spokesperson, Ukrainian forces also attempted to strike the power plant with 8 drones, but all of them were intercepted by the Russian army. Now, Konashnikov says the radiation at the Zaporizhzhia power plant remains normal. However, Ukrainian energy minister posted a statement on social media accusing Russia of shelling around the nuclear power plant. He says Ukraine was on the verge of an accident at that area several times as a result of the shelling of the Russian forces, calling for an effective mechanism and guarantee system to better safeguard the nuclear facilities for civil use. And Russia's defense ministry said on Sunday that Ukrainian forces had resumed attacks around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in the south of the city, including launching 8 kamikaze drones at the facility. The defense ministry says Russian forces shot down all of the drones outside the territory of the nuclear power plant and radiation levels remain normal. Zaporizhzhia, one of Europe's largest nuclear power plants in that location, has been controlled by Russian forces since early March, while its Ukrainian staff continue to operate it. In recent weeks, the site of the plant has been attacked by shelling, sparking international concerns over its safety. Swedish Foreign Minister Ann Linde Christian demands accountability for the heinous crimes, according to her, the Russian army has committed in Ukraine in her speech at the annual gathering at the United Nations on Saturday. Finland and Sweden announced bids to join NATO in May, citing Russia's invasion of Ukraine for their decision to abandon decades of foreign policy neutrality. Sweden and Finland were both neutral throughout the Cold War, and their decision to join NATO is one of the most significant changes in Europe's security architecture for decades, reflecting a sweeping shift in public opinion in the Nordic region since Russia's February 24 invasion.
There is a different story to tell next year. A permanent member of the Security Council has launched an unprovoked, unjustified and illegal aggression against a neighboring country. This was done in blatant disregard of its international obligation and the human suffering that extends far beyond the immediate war zone. Madam President, as UN member states, we also know what is required of us. The General Assembly has come together to demand that Russia immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized border. The General Assembly has reaffirmed Ukrainian sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. The war in Ukraine must stop and Russia's troops withdraw. The fake referenda on Ukrainian territory would be illegal and will have no effect. Neither partial mobilization, the appalling use of nuclear threats, nor any escalation will deter us from supporting Ukraine. Humanitarian law and principle must be upheld and Ukraine's nuclear power plants protected from Russia's illegal and reckless attacks. Accountability for the heinous crimes committed must be ensured. International law must be upheld and decisions by the UN bodies respected. Because of the actions of one country, more than 1.5 billion people in more than half of the UN member states find themselves at greater risk of poverty, starvation, and indebtedness. In January this year, the leader of all 5 nuclear weapon states committed to the prevention of nuclear war and avoiding arms race. They affirmed that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Russia's irresponsible action and nuclear rhetoric since then severely undermines the credibility of its commitments on this pledge.
Moroccan prisoner of war Brahim Sadoun returned home on Saturday after Russia agreed to release 10 foreigners captured in Ukraine following a prison exchange brokered by Saudi Arabia. Mr. Sadoun was greeted by his father, Taher Sadoun, and the media after landing in Casablanca. Sadoun had been sentenced to death by Russia and found guilty of mercenary activities and committing actions aimed at seizing power and overthrowing the constitutional order of the DPR, a sentence condemned by Ukraine and Britain. 10 foreigners were freed last Wednesday following mediation by the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who has maintained close ties with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The timing and size of the swap came as a surprise. Earlier in the day, Putin had announced a partial troop mobilization in Russia in an apparent escalation of the conflict that began in February. Pro-Russian separatists have said last month that the Mariupol commanders will go on trial. Now, Alistair Wilcox, public affairs analyst, joins us now for more on the discussions. Welcome to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and our coverage of it. Could you unmute your device?
Sorry about that. Thanks for having me. It's my most pleasure.
Welcome.
I'm delighted to be with you this
Let's
morning.
begin, if we can, with the Moroccan prisoner swap. Do you see a headway in the war?
Well, I'm not a military. I'm not a very good military analyst. But if I can be reading from from Putin's mindset, he wants to hold as much bargaining power as he can get. And so when those men were arrested, quickly tried, most of them condemned, sentenced to death, and of course their countries will always want to make appeals and make a presentation for their release. And of course, he will always use that as a bargaining chip to get something. Remember, he's not just releasing, it's a prisoner exchange. And for me, that's quite low for a status of the president of Russia to be engaging in such petty. This is what the terrorists use. I mean, terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda, and all those on Taliban, and all those other terrorist organizations, even back home, people like Boko Haram and ISWAP. Those are the tactics that they use to get their members released. But for a country like Russia to be using such as a pawn to get some of their own members released, I think for me, it's quite a low point, and I don't see it as anything significant. I salute those that were released, because those trials cannot be said to have met international standard. They were tried in a hurry and sentenced to death. They may not have met international threshold, but of course, at this point, Putin wants to use anything and everything in order to have some bargaining power. So that's all I see as a bargaining power, nothing substantial or nothing to really give credence to, but rather than to celebrate with the families whose loved ones have been released from his clutches.
What do you make of Sweden and Finland's express intention to join NATO? Now, this was unprecedented back in the day, as we saw their neutrality in the Cold War. That's like saying Switzerland wants an attacking standing army, and Finland is a totally different kettle of fish. What do you make of their posture?
Well, let me commend the foreign minister. Is it of Sweden or Finland? I can't remember. The one that you just had is, yeah, the Swedish foreign minister. Her statement was quite forthright. I don't know, this morning I just thought about Sweden. When I was taking my bath, I didn't even know I was going to comment about her. She made a good position. The action of one man has changed the entire dynamics of the world. Sweden and Finland and some of these Scandinavian countries have remained neutral. In fact, I'm sure I've not read much about their military history, but they have remained neutral in all world crises. And they see themselves as a peaceful nation. But with what Putin has done, when a man can wake up, no matter the level of provocation that doesn't warrant a war, and then you invade a sovereign state just to show power, to occupy, and to make it, and to annex. First, it started with annexation, then occupation, and further wanting to annex Ukraine. So who is Sweden? A country without a standing army. Who is Finland? A very small nation. So, like she said, that action has changed the dynamics of the world. And that means nobody takes that in his right senses. Russia will do what they did. While the whole story was going, while the whole issues were brewing up, Putin kept denying that he wasn't having intention to invade Ukraine. But we saw it happen. He broke all his promises. So if he can do that to Ukraine, a bigger country, I mean, Sweden will just be a walkover. Finland will just be a walkover. So for them, it's a matter of security. It's a matter of, for us, let us look at how we protect ourselves. Because if things can happen to a sovereign country like Ukraine, a big country, a semi-war power like Ukraine, then who are we? So it's a matter of man, know thyself. And I think, and I love the way she put it. And it is time for the UN to wake up. I don't know the UN role. I mean, much role they've played in this crisis, but I think it's time for it, because she also alluded to the fact that over 1.5 billion people are put into hunger, starvation, economic turmoil. Nigeria is affected. I mean, today we have issues
finally,
from Russia. And so that is just...
Pardon interruption. Let me jump in here. Yeah. Mr. Wilcox. Finally, the nuclear power plants and the activities around it and the counter-accusations, it seems as if a lot of song and dance is being made between the two sides. Are you surprised that this is happening? Nobody wants a Chernobyl. Nobody wants that to happen. So what do you make of the antics of the Russian forces concerning the security of the power plant and not causing a nuclear accident?
Well, Russia is playing to the international gallery. Certainly, I also know that why Russia is not receiving the full brunt of international military power is because of the threat of nuclear. Russia is a nuclear country, and they know what they have. Other parts of the world knows what Russia have. And for a man without democratic norms, he can do anything. As it is now, as far as Putin is concerned, it's either make or break. So nuclear is a very powerful world security architecture. And nobody, like you said, nobody wants Chernobyl to happen. But of course, Russia knows fully well that they are in the thick of it. And if it happens, they will be the first casualty. And so that plant, it's right in Ukrainian territory. So Russia is trying to use that again as a bargaining chip. Okay, we are protecting it because we don't want a nuclear escalation. But again, they keep threatening the world with nuclear deployment. So it's like playing to the gallery. And of course, Ukraine too will not want that plant to be that facility to be exploded. So everybody is trying to see what advantage that they can get from that plant. Nobody wants a nuclear disaster, sincerely. Not even Russia at this point. Because if you look at back home, Russia is having backlashes from its citizens. What has never happened in years. Russia is having backlash because of this new technique of reservists. So the public opinion within the Russian state is not favorable to the Putin administration. Yes, they might have a group that support. It's not favorable. So every side is trying to be cautious at this point, and of course, Russia too is to be cautious. But they keep threatening the world with nuclear deployment, and so that shows the mindset that it's all a game, and they wouldn't care, my brother. They wouldn't care because as a man, the way Putin is going about now, I wonder if he really has the interest of his people and that of the world at heart. But of course, nuclear have a lot to lose if that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wilcox.
Comes up in flames.
We really appreciate your thoughts on the issues. Mr. Alistair Wilcox, Public Affairs Analyst, joining us on the program. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's always my pleasure. Anytime. Have a lovely day. Thank you.
You too. You're watching the Russian coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. After the break, some business analysis on how it's affecting things around the world. Please stay with us. Welcome back. When the Federal Reserve chose to go for the third consecutive interest rate hike on September 21st to contain inflation, running at a decade high, 8.3% in August, stocks and bonds markets around the world got nervous. Now the dollar index has climbed to a fresh 20-year high, capping oil price gains and leading to the fall of currencies around the world. Once again, the warning of the World Bank of a global recession reverberates. To make head and tail of this is Ini John Mekwa, business correspondent. It's good to see you, Ini.
Good to see you, Lumide. Good morning.
Now, can we just go straight to the meat of it?
Sure.
What does that all mean in layman's terms?
Yeah, so what it means is because of inflation. Okay, so it starts, obviously, we're on Russia invasion, and we know that Russia is a major contributor of oil and gas supply to a lot of countries, especially in Europe, and that's what gives them energy. So because of the sanctions, because of the negative sentiment around Russia, there hasn't been supply, and so because of reduced supply, there has been increase in the price of energy, and that has led to inflation in a lot of countries. So we've seen a lot of countries hiking interest rate. Nigeria is meeting tomorrow, and most likely they're going to hike. Bank of England met last week, they hiked. Federal Reserve is the one that really shook the world because a lot of commodities are denominated in the dollar. So once that interest rate is hiked, it means that accessing fund is more expensive, and the currency of that country becomes more valuable. So when the dollar becomes more valuable, it is good for Americans living in America, because what it means is their dollar can buy more things if they want to import things. But it has a negative effect on other countries. So that's why we've seen a lot of currencies. Last week, the pound was down to a 37-year low. This morning is about down, is worse than that. You know, they also have their own issues also.
How much of it is due to their own internal issues, as you just mentioned?
Exactly.
The tax costs.
Yeah, tax cuts is also driving that. Yeah. But you trace most of it back to the energy costs. Right. Energy costs is fueling inflation massively, and that is why they even need to hike interest rates at all, and that is why they even have a high cost of living. You understand? And that is why they're talking about tax cuts. So it all goes back to energy costs. And
since the Russian invasion of Ukraine doesn't seem to be about to end anytime soon, what measures can be taken by economies around the world as a stopgap?
Well, the World Bank has warned. Well, before I go there, another consequences, because we've talked about Europe and UK and all of that, what about Nigeria? What about emerging economies? What it means, a stronger dollar means that our debt servicing, most of our debt are in dollars, debt servicing is now higher. So if we were complaining before that more than 100% of our revenue is used to service debt, then we might be looking at much, much more than that. Now, the World Bank has warned that if something is not done about this, there's going to be recession, because what dealing with inflation with interest rates does is to reduce production and consumption. That means that they reduce the rate at which economy is producing and demand. So it leads to a recession. So the World Bank is warning that there may be recession next year if nothing is done. Maybe central banks.
And we don't want to see a recession.
No,
global recession.
Remember the last time we had recession? Yes. It was not a good one at all. And we're not done with the pandemic. We have this Russian.
Recession is a bad word.
It's a bad word.
So is invasion. Thank you, Ini.
Thank you for having me.
Ini will be back in a few minutes on Business Morning, so you'll stay tuned to Channels Television for that. Very quickly, Scotland makes the trip to Kharkiv to face Ukraine on Tuesday in the UEFA Nations League, knowing that a draw will be enough to earn a promotion to the top tier of the competition. However, Ukraine will take that spot in the league if they prevail against opponents who they are meeting for the third time in as many months. From the last 13 outings, Ukraine only suffered defeat on 2 occasions, each of those losses coming against British opposition in Wales and Scotland. Nevertheless, Ukraine were deserved victors when they beat Scotland at Hampden Park in their World Cup playoff in June, evidence that they are capable of rising to the occasion in a one-off match. And Ukraine's Alexander Usyk claims WC champion Tyson Fury is scared of fighting him. Usyk insists Fury is pursuing a showdown with Anthony Joshua, who lost 3 of his last 5 bouts because he's not sure he can win against him. Fury tried to face Usyk in an undisputed fight for December, but Usyk says he is not planning to fight again till early 2023. Usyk, who holds the IBF, IBO, WBA, WBO titles, is coming off back-to-back decision wins over Anthony Joshua. And that's it for today's coverage of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Thanks for being with us this morning. Do join us again tomorrow. I'm Olumide Macaulay. See you again.